Thank you for that wonderful song. So, a few years ago, I was reading an article about things that Americans do that people in other countries, particularly Europe, find odd. And the one thing that stuck with me out of this list of about 20 or so things was that we use the question, "How are you?" as a greeting. I worked at a coffee shop a few years ago, and it never rang truer than it did during my time there. People would stumble in up to the counter, half asleep, to get their caffeine fix, but they would still often say, "Morning, how are you?" And usually I would respond with some rendition of, "Good, how are you? And what can I get for you?" Almost without fail, they would respond with their own groggy, "Good," and then launch into their order. About halfway through my time at the coffee shop, I was curious, I was tired, my week was not going well, and I was not happy to be at work. So when a customer came up and asked how I was, I responded, "Awful, thanks, how are you?" And without skipping a beat, they said, "Good, thanks. Can I get a venti, 4-shot mocha, with half the pumps of mocha and a half pump of vanilla?" Of course, I gave them their order, but this just amused me, and I really didn't blame them. So busy with their life, and likely so focused on where they needed to be after they got their coffee, that they never even thought that I would respond with anything other than the standard "good." But the truth is, so many people are so busy that they sometimes do not stop to actually listen to what someone's answer is when we ask, cordially, "How are you?" I've been guilty of this myself, glossing over what someone is saying. Well, if it's because I'm tired or because I have a lot on my mind, sometimes I just don't have the energy to listen and really care about what they say. It can be hard to go against what you've been conditioned to do, even with close friends and family, but many of us have been raised to politely ask others, "How are you?" And when asked this ourselves, respond with "Good, thanks." But this passage of Romans calls us to do something else. We are all one body, yes, and I'm sure all of us have heard preached before that this means that we all have different functions within the church. But what if we took this analogy a step further and tied it into the call to be devoted to one another in love? To honor one another above ourselves, to share with those who are in need, to rejoice with those who rejoice, and to mourn with those who mourn. Think about it. When a part of the body is hurt, say if you step on a Lego or get a paper cut, what happens? That part of the body sends signals alerting the brain and even other body parts of the injury. And the brain and the rest of the body respond in kind, sending endorphins to dull the pain and anything else necessary to help the injury. For example, in the case of the paper cut, the blood starts clotting. However, what happens if the pain signals are never received? Or what if the signals are never sent in the first place? What happens then? Conversely, what happens in the body when we eat a delicious meal? If there are no pleasure signals sent about that meal, then eating that same meal becomes a chore. So what happens when we try to communicate and people don't listen? As this and many other passages indicate, we are meant to live as a community because we are the body of Christ. But what happens when one part of the body is in pain and another part doesn't notice? Or conversely, what happens if one part of the body is rejoicing but the other parts ignore it? What happens when one part of the community is sending the signals but getting no response? It can make that part of the community feel unimportant, or at least like their feelings are invalid and not worth sharing. Like when I was younger, and my older brothers would tease me mercilessly until long after I'd asked them to stop. I finally learned that they weren't going to listen, and I would just walk away rather than engage or bother telling them to stop. On the flip side of this, the signals need to be sent in the first place in order for the body to know what is wrong. One of my relatives is diabetic and can't feel their feet. So every now and then they will injure their foot and not realize until they've walked around for quite a bit. This metaphor can apply to the body of Christ as well, because if people do not share their sadness through mourning, or do not rejoice in times of happiness, there is no way for the larger community to understand their joys and concerns. So what does all of this mean for us? It means that we should build trust within our Christian community. It means we should build spaces where we can feel comfortable enough to share our joys and our concerns. It means that we should build spaces where we can laugh with each other, where we can cry with each other. And it means that we should feel comfortable with each other overall and be able to share any emotions that we might feel. It can be difficult to be vulnerable like this. It can be difficult to share our emotions. And it can be so easy to focus on things like hope and think we shouldn't allow much time for emotions like sadness or distress to linger. But the fact of the matter is that sadness is an inevitable part of life as well. And even Jesus wept. Even Jesus rejoiced. But the beauty of living within a Christian community, living within the body of Christ, is that we don't have to bear the sadness alone. And we don't have to rejoice by ourselves either. Because we are to live as one body, to love sincerely, we can mourn with each other, we can laugh with each other, and we can rejoice with each other. But living in harmony with one another, we can share both the joy and sadness with each other. And both of these, when we have a trusting community, are better shared than if we keep them to ourselves. As they say, blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Sharing sadness is an old tradition, which is why we have so many lament psalms, particularly community lament psalms that were meant to be used when the community was in mourning. And who among us hasn't felt blessed to have good news shared with us? Whether it be a small event, like doing really well on an assignment, or a big event, like how my brother and his wife had their first child earlier this year. And so, just as it is not good to isolate one part of the body, neither is it good to isolate ourselves or a single person from the body of Christ.